Today's episode is brought to you by SVS. Based in Youngstown, Ohio, SVS delivers thrilling and immersive audio experiences from their highly acclaimed speakers, subwoofers, cables, wireless audio gear, and more. SVS is leading a sound revolution by offering expert support, generous owner benefits, and a world-class performance that far exceeds the price. Learn more at svsound.com. That's S as in speaker, V as in volume, sound.com. Today's episode is also sponsored by Shit Audio. Shit Audio designs and builds audio components in California and Texas. Based in Valencia and Corpus Christi, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit shit.com or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's SCHIIT.com. Today's episode is brought to you by Musical Surroundings. For over 30 years, Musical Surroundings has distributed high-performance analog playback equipment to vinyl enthusiasts and music lovers throughout the United States. Based in Oakland, California, Musical Surroundings represents world-class brands like Clear Audio, Hanna, DS Audio, and their own line of Musical Surroundings phono preamplifiers. To learn more about the exceptional turntables, cartridges, and analog accessories they offer, visit musicalsurroundings.com. That's musicalsurroundings.com. Hello, dear friends, and thank you for joining us. The Occasional Podcast, Season 6, Episode 7, nearing the end of the year. And we here at the Occasional Podcast and Part-Time Audiophile Network have a lot of extra info to kind of call all the good info, all the good product stuff in high fidelity and audio products for you. So I just want to send a quick reminder out. Don't forget to check out the Part-Time Audiophile site. We have our buyer's guide for the end of the year is live and a bunch of other fun end of the year stuff coming out and awards. So keep a hot eye on the Part-Time Audiophile site. And also here, we'll get some stuff together to kind of get ears on what we thought was the best sounding stuff of this year. And believe it or not, there's a lot of stuff that got heard and a lot of stuff still came out. So the hi-fi industry is still alive and thriving, and we're excited to be a part of that. This episode is really an extension of something that Mark Phillips and I have been exploring all season, and that is the idea of British hi-fi. A crucial element to some of the mainstays of British hi-fi is the introduction of the LS3 by the BBC quite some years ago. And in order to extend our knowledge into the subject even further, we decided to invite Jerry Bloomfield from Falcon Acoustics to the show, who has a vast history with the product. He's remade it, he's redone it, he has all kinds of really fun, interesting information on it. And we want to give that to you, and we, believe it or not, we have yet another kind of exploration into British hi-fi coming later in the season, so we're really flushing this thing out. But both Mark and myself agree there is some really fantastic sounds that came out of this evolution, this important piece of time in hi-fi history. So we find it worthwhile to keep exploring. So I hope you guys enjoy. As we say, on with the show. Here we go. Today's show is also sponsored by Wharfedale. For nearly 90 years, Wharfedale has built loudspeakers for music lovers all over the world. With a warm and natural sound signature, their inherently high-fidelity sonic retrieval simply makes you want to listen to your music for longer. Visit wharfdaleusa.com to discover the high-value Diamond 12 series, the best-selling Linton Heritage, and the no-holds-barred Elysian. That's WHARFEDALEUSA.com. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. A history and the legacy of the LS3 loudspeaker. I highly encourage you guys to check out what is British Hi-Fi. Mark Phillips and myself kind of explored that a little bit. And this podcast was born out of that one, where a huge chunk of that history of the British sound comes from the LS3 5A. We decided to kind of dip down into that even further and bring on an additional guest who is vastly familiar with this model of loudspeaker. Joining us today, Mark Phillips from PTA Productions again. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great.
And also Jerry Bloomfield, Director of Falcon Acoustics from across the pond. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, thank you. Good.
So, Jerry, I kind of wanted to just start this podcast off with asking you what your thoughts are about the very early beginnings of the BBC getting involved in speaker production. Why would the BBC want to get involved in something on the manufacturing end like this, in your opinion? And were they involved in any other products besides loudspeakers?
Very much so. I think the first thing is to put a context that the BBC is still a large public service broadcaster in the UK. It has a multiplicity of studios all over the country, a strong regional presence, and it really has always been involved in research, both in audio and video, from the very early days. Give you an example, 1925 it was doing experimental stereo broadcasts. So it's always been in the vanguard of research. As to why it got involved specifically in loudspeakers, there are several answers. One is cultural, because they believed that they could do it better than anybody else, and probably could. The second is the fact that they tried to use commercial units, and they were so inconsistent that they threw up their hands in horror and decided the only thing to do was to do it themselves, because that way they could ensure consistency throughout all the regional applications that they had. And the third thing, as I've said already, is because it was there, and that's what the BBC did. It did it itself, because in those days in the UK we had a manufacturing base and we had the skills to be able to do it.
Yeah, and I even noticed, I guess early on in my music-loving career, that the BBC was involved in also the promotion of specific individuals and artists. Like I was shocked to find out that the Led Zeppelin had the BBC sessions, and there was here was this government entity of sorts out there, and that was a vastly different kind of thing than what the U.S. would ever get involved in. There's no like U.S. sessions, or the government's not tied up in any type of those things. So I always found that to be slightly unique to Britain and the way they did things. And it appears that the government, is involved in more things on more levels than we usually kind of do here in the U.S., at least from a branding perspective, obviously.
Well, I think you'll find that the government is eager to separate itself from the BBC at the moment. There's a lot of tension between the BBC and the government over here. But the BBC then had a remit as a public service broadcaster to represent all facets of entertainment. It was the primary source of entertainment. Commercial radio and commercial television wasn't around when the BBC was doing a lot of this work. So it had a very wide remit, and a very wide remit which included a social responsibility to bring as much variation as possible in programming to as many people as possible, hence the kind of variety that you're talking about.
So there's a lot of things that the BBC did make, and the LS3 5A has really stuck out for audiophile applications against all the other products that have kind of been talked about. Now, there even are more loudspeakers that are somewhat popular, had a little bit of longevity. But why do you think that the LS3 5A stuck out amongst all that backdrop?
I think the easiest answer to that is to say it's a very good speaker at what it does. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It's a very consistent product. The specification, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is extremely tight. And we still get people who just stop in their tracks at shows and say, what is that? When they look at an LS3 5A, I've never heard anything like that coming out of a small speaker. So you have something which I believe is a speaker that, apart from all the work that went into designing it and everything else, it is actually an extremely good piece of equipment, and it stood the test of time much better than most.
And I think we haven't really touched upon this yet, but from what I gathered in our original podcast, the purpose of the LS3 5A, at least originally to some extent, was mobile vans, or at least small setups with broadcast. emphasizing the human voice. Would you say that's somewhat
Yes,
accurate?
I think that's true. But you've got to go back to the 1960s, actually, before the LS3 5A in order to get the real flavor of it. The first thing is to come back onto the research side that the BBC were doing, that the BBC were involved in the early explorations of different cone materials. They were interested in plastics and the use of plastics. Up to that point, the cone materials exclusively used were paper, and you had a lot of research going on. You have a lot of parallel tracks to pull together, parallel threads to pull together here. The first one is that they were doing this research. The second one is the formation of KEF by Raymond Cook back in 1962. He worked for Gilbert Briggs and he wanted to explore different cone materials. Briggs wasn't interested. He thought paper cones were absolutely fine. And so you have the formation of KEF and their concentration on the use of new cone materials, plastics, sandwich cones, that type of thing. So you have those parallel tracking. You then come back to the BBC's remit as a broadcaster, and the BBC is trying to modernise the acoustics in the Maida Vale studios, where a lot of the sessions that you were talking about were actually done, which are sadly about to close. They were doing 1/8 acoustic scaling there, and they had to design their own loudspeaker to do that. Everything was scaled down, and at that point there was a decision taken that they wanted a small monitor speaker to go inside studios, that type of thing. They started, being the BBC, they started to try and design their own 5-inch drive unit to go with it. They were very good at woofers, but this one failed, and they went down to KEF and saw my colleague Malcolm, who's the original founder of Falcon, and said, "We can't get this one to work. Can you help?" And Malcolm said, "Well, I can do better than that. Here's a drive unit. It's called the B110. We've had it in commercial production for the past 5 years. Why don't you play with this instead? It's got a Bextreme cone made out of plastic." And everybody said, "Oh, that's a good idea." So they took them off. They were already using the KEF T27 Tweeter, the original version, and they produced the LS3 which was done in very small numbers. There were 20 of them. There are still 5 of the original cabinets existing. We've got 2 of them, and with some of the insides. And they spent, if I tell you that they spent in those days in sterling terms, it's £100,000 on designing this loudspeaker in this most beautiful R&D department set on a country estate outside London. Gives you an idea. That's $2.5 million by conventional standards. You wouldn't spend that on a loudspeaker these days. Having done that, they then said, "Oh, that was a good idea," and they put the LS3 on a shelf and left it there for about 4 years. You can visualize a large bureaucratic organization with departments not talking to each other. And this particular instance, you're quite right, they wanted a small speaker for outside broadcast. And at the same time, they were approached by a number of manufacturers who said, "Have you got a small speaker that you've designed that we could license, that we could sell?" So the sales department promptly licensed the LS3 to Rogers, and then discovered that they couldn't actually build it because the drive units that they were using were no longer produced. KEF had moved on. So the genesis of the LS3 is where KEF supplied them with the updated drive units. The BBC design department at that point, and we're now talking 1972, took it over, remodeled it, redid the crossover. It's a complicated crossover. And finally, the LS3 launched in 1974, and that's the model that we know now. And if anybody, for those who are interested, we took over a rebuilt LS3 to the Rocky Mountain show about 3 years ago. We took over our LS3 museum in a room, and we had them playing there. And I dug out the frequency response this evening to have a look at for this conversation. It wasn't a bad speaker at all. It sounded very nice indeed. It was a good speaker. But that's how the LS3 came into. That's the genesis of the LS3 It's a mixture of bureaucracy and accident, I think is the best way of putting it.
And I think I was in that room too. So I was there and I got to hear that one. So I will concur that It was unbelievable experience.
Yeah. What was interesting to us, and we had all sorts of people come along. I think we had 7 different models at that show. I can't remember how many we managed to sneak through. There was a big long string of them anyway, and they all sounded extraordinarily similar, with the exception of the later 811 model, which shouted a bit. But I think that was probably because of the way the drive units were sitting at the time. But the similarity between all the various versions comes back to the central point of the LS3 5A as designed is consistency, so that you could get an engineer going from London to Liverpool to Birmingham to Edinburgh, going into the studio, and what you saw is what he wanted and it was what he was used to, and he was able to QC from that without any impedance whatsoever. He was tuned into what was being provided.
That is a remarkably helpful thing for people in that industry too. Consistency is constantly.
Absolutely.
It's shocking just even doing the editing for this podcast, how, I don't know if the listeners realize this, but how different everything can sound from every different driver. And when you're trying to EQ something or create, the original, consistency becomes paramount to the whole process. So that is a very good point. In today's modern market, the overlap between production speakers and hi-fi is relatively low. This kind of seems like it wasn't the case for the LS3 5A. How do you think the two markets have evolved since the heyday of the BBC speakers? Is this something that's specific to the UK versus US culture markets?
Depends what you mean by production speaker. Do you mean production speakers as is used by professionals for monitoring purposes, day in, day out?
The difference is someone who uses the speaker for production purposes to make music, or someone who just uses it like an audio file to ingest.
Most of the sound engineers that I know are not interested in the audiophile market per se. And I'm probably going to get flamed for this, but what they want is something, again, and we come back to the word consistency, which is going to come into this conversation an awful lot. That what they want to do is to go to their desk at 9 o'clock in the morning, having left it at 4 o'clock, whenever it was before, get everything backed up to speed, and it sounds like it did before, and they want to make sure that they continue with that equipment because that's what their ears and their production systems are tuned into. It's the same in broadcasting studios. So they're not interested in the latest gadget or the latest change of this or tweak of that. What they want is what they're used to. So that's our experience anyway. We spend a lot of our time as Falcon Acoustics supplying drive units to people all over the world. A lot of studio engineers are heartbroken if there's the smallest possible change even in that.
Do you feel that the components of the LS3 5A compared to other speakers are in any way harder, unique, or more complicated to produce? Or is it pretty simple and it's just like, what is it a hard speaker to make?
It's a very hard speaker to make.
Oh, it is?
Oh, yes, it's a very hard speaker to make. The first thing is that the cabinet specification is actually so precise that you have no room for maneuver in terms of what you put into it. We have now, with our people, got to the point of specification where we know exactly what goes in. We even weigh plywood sheets before we cut them to make sure there aren't any density issues, because that affects the sound so much. If you have the wrong density of timber fillet inside, wood fillet inside it, we use beech, close grain beech. If that's got the wrong density, it affects the sound. And you then come on to the crossover where you're using auto transformers. Nobody in their right mind these days will use auto transformers as inductors. It's what the BBC did and it's what is specified. The drive units are pair matched and they are very tight specification right the way through. You even have to be careful how you torque the screws on the front board because you can affect the sound that way as well. It is probably the tightest specification of any speaker on the market at the moment. That has been in regular production for a long time.
So all that being said, as we mentioned earlier, Falcon Acoustics is doing an LS3 5A reissue. Why would you choose to relaunch the LS3 5A at this point in time?
Well, we've had it on the market for some years now, and we have to go back a little bit into history. The first thing is that the founder of Falcon Acoustics is Malcolm Jones, and he's the original designer at KEF of the B110 and the T27, and the B139, which we now make as well. And when I took over the company from Malcolm after his wife had died, sadly, and we're going back to 2009 now, we used to have regular sessions in the evenings. I used to go and see him once or twice a month, and we would go out usually for a large curry and probably too many glasses of wine. And we decided it was a good idea one evening that we would start to remanufacture the B110 and the T27 because nobody else was doing it. It seemed like a natural fit for Falcon to do. It was two silly old men making a bad decision in one way because the amount of work that it involved was nobody's business. We spent 2.5 years getting the woofers and things like that sorted out. But we're old and we have the patience to do these things, and we were just trying to get it right. We got the B110 working properly. We got the T27 working properly, and they carried on for a while. And then I decided that because we had lots of people from the LS3 5A fraternity, as we call them, buying drive units to replace their own drive units, which was the original objective, that we ought to start doing some parts for the LS3 5A. So we started doing the crossovers again. And the various components that went into the LS3 5A gradually accrued on the site. There was a little bit of unfinished business for Falcon in that back in 1982, Malcolm applied as Falcon for an LS3 5A license. And he was then making crossovers for Goodman's, and so what he did to show that he could do it was to put a couple of production crossovers into the BBC as a test piece, and they rejected them, saying they were too close to tolerance, and therefore they couldn't be capable of being produced to that tolerance, whereas all he'd actually done was to take a couple out of the box labelled Goodman's that he hadn't shipped out that week. It irritated him for a long time, and when I took over the company, he said, we must sometime talk about the LS3 5A. And we sat down one evening again and we said, well, logically, we ought to do the LS3 5A. We can make it. We've got all the bits. Why shouldn't we try again? And so we went to the BBC, Malcolm and I, and we sat down there with all our parts. And I carried all the bits in an old picnic basket held together with string because I couldn't find anything that was actually big enough to take all the parts. And we undid them in this lovely glass office that they have with little meeting rooms off. And they all sat there with their mouths open. And people said, we haven't seen that since 1974. How did you do this? What did you do that? And so we talked about it for a while. And they were very kind and supportive. I think we had about 50 people around our table by the time we'd finished, all looking at what we were doing. And I said, we came to actually see if we could have a license. Oh, that's fine. That's not the difficult bit. How did you do this? What did you do there? The level of support that we got from them and the encouragement that the BBC gave us at the time was fundamental to the success of the whole thing. And that's how it started. So we started making it again basically because we could, and they wanted us to.
Did you, in that iteration, was the goal just to make the exact same speaker that was made before? Is this Falcon version exactly the same? Or is it something that you wanted to either update the Sonics to a modern thing, or how close to the original vision do you feel like the speaker is?
We wanted to make the first ones that we did, we wanted to make it as close as we could to the original vision, and we wanted to make it as close as we possibly could to the BBC specification. And I think we did it okay. I remember the first pair that we built. I have a workshop downstairs from where I'm sitting now, which is an old converted garage, and we sat there having built these things over a couple of days because both of us were sort of feeling our way a bit with it. And we brought them up to my listening area here, put them on, and quite literally the hair stood up on the back of my neck because I thought I didn't know how it was going to sound, and I just thought, oh, we've got something here. We've done something all right. And Malcolm, who comes from Yorkshire, said, there's not much wrong with that. And that was the end of it. It was one of those evenings. It was serendipity. So it's a combination of us doing the drive units and then gradually accruing the parts and then putting it all together. That was the original version. The gold badge is the development of that, and I'm sure we'll come to that later on.
Yeah, I think Mark had a couple questions about that version. Mark, you want to?
Well, first of all, I had the pleasure of reviewing the Falcon Acoustics LS3 5A, the MoFi edition, just a couple of months ago. And it was that same kind of illuminating experience where I said, oh my God, they still sound fantastic after all these years. I almost bought a pair of Spendor LS3 5As probably back in 1991 or 1992. And I still I wrote about this in the review, but I kind of regret not buying them back then because I might have gone on a different path. This MoFi edition that came out, it's $19.95 a pair. It's plain black. So what I wanted to know is I talked to John Durda of MoFi, and he explained how it was MoFi really, since they were the distributors in the U.S., they really wanted to bring out a version that would be inexpensive enough or an introductory price where people will go, oh, maybe for $19.95 I can take another chance and give this a try. What did that discussion look like on your end? How did they approach you about this, and what were your objectives?
The objectives were very clear, that they wanted an LS35A that was actually accessible to precisely where you've come from. That was accessible to people to be able to afford it, because the main LS35A that we have with all the fancy veneers, it's a boutique speaker. It's not a cheap speaker by conventional standards. It costs a lot to make, therefore the price reflects that. What they got, and what we were asked to do, was the original version that we bought out with what we now call the silver badge crossover. They wanted it in black, and it's the previous iteration of the LS35A compared to the gold badge, but none the worse for that. It wasn't stripped down in quality in any way whatsoever. It was a genuine LS35A that they were able to market at that price.
And you bring up the gold badge version,
Yeah.
and when John Durda first started talking to me about the LS35A, the first thing he brought up was the Kingswood Warren version of it.
Yes,
and which there were only 50 of them by the time he told me.
Correct.
They were already all gone. And I thought to myself, why are you telling me after the fact? I would have loved to get in that line and take a chance, but. Tell us a little bit about the gold badge version and what you've done to it, and bring in the Kingswood Warren edition if you can.
Okay, right. Well, the Kingswood Warren edition started when I looked at a few boxes of transformer laminations that I was using to keep my door open in the summer. Malcolm had given me these boxes when we were clearing out Falcon from where it was before. He said, you may find these useful one day, and I didn't pay any attention to them, quite honestly. And I used them literally as a doorstop. About £10,000 worth of laminations doorstop, I subsequently discovered, but a doorstop nonetheless. And I was looking at them one day, and I thought, maybe I should look at these a bit more closely. We just managed to get LS3 5 pairs numbers 3 and 4. They belonged to a chap who lived about 20 miles from here, and he phoned me up one day. He said, I've got these old LS3 5A bits. I don't know if you're interested in having them, but if you'd like to come over, we can discuss, maybe do a swap for a pair of speakers or something like that. So I had in my hands then some of the original BBC R&D department inductors from when they were making them. The first thing that we noticed was that the inductors were smaller than the production ones. That when the things when the LS35A went into commercial production back in the 70s, the inductors were reduced in size, and various things were changed very slightly to make it more commercially viable. I understand that, and I realised that what I actually had was 4 boxes of the original laminations for the BBC transformers. And I thought, well, if I've got the laminations, which is a material that's not available anymore, why don't we reconstruct the BBC inductors? Just purely as an academic exercise as much as anything else. And then I said, if we're going to do that, why don't we go back to the original capacitive film, which isn't made anymore, see if we can get some of that. Can we reproduce what they actually made at the end of the day in R&D to get it to work? Can we make an LS35A that was exactly as the BBC built it back in 1972-73? It took me a year to locate the film, found somebody to make the capacitors that I wanted, we managed to make the transformer inductors, and from that we then made a thin wall cabinet. There are 2 thicknesses to the LS35A cabinet, 9mm and 12mm. We replicated from the examples that I had the original cabinets that the BBC made. We had the drive units, and that's the Kingswood Warren. And it's called Kingswood Warren because that's the name of the R&D, the research and development facility that the BBC had outside of London. And it was a homage to the work that they did, and we dedicated to the guys that were there. And everybody said, you're never going to sell an LS35A at £6,500, $8,500 or whatever it was, because that's crazy. And they went in 8 days. They sound exquisite. They sound really wonderful. There's a quality there's a synergy between what we did with the transformers and the inductors and with the capacitors that you just didn't get in anything that was being made commercially at the time. and you had what I call spaces between the notes. There was a quietness to them. There was a sort of precision and a kind of almost a sort of an analytical quality to the way the music was being played. You could hear individual notes and the spaces between the notes that you don't get very often in loudspeakers. You could see where the differences were. And if you did an A/B comparison between a production LS3 of ours at the time and a Kingswood Warren, the difference was quite remarkable. And from that evolved the gold badge, because what we decided to do was we re-engineered the transformer inductors that we had in production so that they were effectively the same as the original BBC ones, but not using the complicated clamping system that they had with it, much more friendly to production. And we looked around for film that gave us the same sonic qualities as the polycarbonate film. I would say we got there with the gold badge. I would say it's about 95% of the way to the polycarbonate sound, the sound of the Kingswood Warren. It's as close as we can get realistically in production without ramping the price up to what we did with the Kingswood Warren. And we released it in January of last year, quietly. We didn't put the price up. I'm not a noise person. I'm a very private person, so we do these things very quietly. And everybody said, "What have you done?" I remember Ken Kessler, who I'm sure you both know. I took him over a pair of the Kingswood Warrens, and I said, he just reviewed the original ones. And I said, "I've got something here for you to just have a quick listen to, Ken, just see what you think." And I just made him shut his eyes as I changed the speakers over in his listening room. And he shot out of the chair and said, "What have you done?" And we've tried to achieve that, and I think we have with the gold badge, because the gold badge, I think, is universally regarded now as the standard that people aim for in an LS3 5A. It is sonically as good as you can get a production one without really having to push the price up to the point where it becomes unattainable.
And so the gold badge version, this is something that's going to be a permanent part of the line for now. This isn't a special edition, because I almost thought I ran out of time to even check out a gold badge version. But it's good to know that they are still available. They're available here. I mean, the MoFi is $2,000 a pair. The gold badge are $3,000 a pair, which is still very very reasonable considering. The first pair, I heard some LS3 5As maybe about 10, 12 years ago, and they were $3,000 a pair. And then if you went out looking for an original pair in good condition, you're paying $3,000 for it. So it's an amazing price, which is one of the reasons I got so excited about the MoFi edition of 2000. Yeah. I said, this is amazing sound for 2000.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's the gold badge has been a big success for us. We're actually forward ordered it well into next year on it. And we have a waiting list on it.
So you've kind of spoken about the sound of this speaker being really good historically. Yep. How do you feel about the sound in a very general, broad stroke about the way the audiophile sound or just music reproduction in general has come? Do things sound better now than they ever have before, or are there vintage pieces out there that set the bar and has not been hit since?
That's a very difficult question to answer, because it becomes that's a very subjective thing. It's a personal opinion. Mm-hmm. I will tell you that I walk around audio shows wincing, quite honestly.
It's a tough situation, but yes, not every sound that comes at an audio show is great. Yes.
I listen to. I listen to the latest things, and I find the voicing is not to my taste. Shall I be politic and just leave it there?
Sure.
What I do know is that we get people coming into our room and they just sit down and say, "Oh, thank goodness, I can actually listen to some music," and then we have to reject them after about 30 minutes because other people are queuing to get into the seats. But the interesting thing about the gold badge, though, coming back to that again, and you sort of the audiophile thing, we don't sell to existing LS3 5A's whole owners in the same way as people used to. We are selling to new people because the numbers that we're seeing going out now is a new audience. It's attracting a new audience who appreciate it for what it is. And you'll notice I'm trying to probably avoid your question on audiophiles because I can be quite blunt about it, and I'm trying to be polite.
Look, it's a very unique group of guys. We love them for their passion, but obviously it's diverse. Yes.
Well, I try not to abuse anybody, but it does get tempting sometimes, so I'm going to leave it. I try to make speakers that make music. That's what I mean. At the end of the day, what we're all doing is we're listening to music reproduced as best as we possibly can, but also it's got to sound like music. It's got to sound like it was meant to. We use live recordings quite a lot in our demonstrations because that's what it sounds like. There's a lot of artificiality in the production qualities now, in many of the recordings that I listen to. You go back to some of the earlier stuff, and you come back to Mobile Fidelity and some of their masters that they produce on vinyl, and you listen to the old equalizations and the old production, and they sound right. You listen to some of the modern stuff. I try not to listen to the modern stuff very much because, frankly, it's not my thing. But it just also, all the equalization is wrong. It's what I call boom and tinkle. And I think that's being applied to a lot of modern speakers as well. That they're designed for dynamic presence and going, oh, listen to that, as opposed to sitting down and actually listening to music. That's a personal opinion, and I'll probably get, as I say, flamed for it.
Well, I'll stand next to you and support that because I feel the same way about a lot of things.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the reason I got into British Hi-Fi is just it's the mid-range, and that's where most of the music is, and it just all sounds real. And not only does the British BBC designed speakers sound real, but they sound real in people's houses where they live. You don't have to have this gigantic listening room to listen to them. You can plop them down in the living room and still get amazing sound from them. And that's one of the great things about the BritFi speakers and everything else.
That's also part of the BBC legacy as well, because the BBC voicing, which we work with every day, it concentrates on where the majority of the information actually is. And you're absolutely right, and it's in the mid-range area. And that informs, I think, a lot of the way that British Hi-Fi has evolved over the years. I think that's part of the things that's trickled down through from the BBC's work. There is a British sound. There's no question of that.
I brought this up in the last podcast. I just want to interject this real quick while we're on the subject. That in a previous episode that we talked about mastering with Dave McNair, he said two things I like to reiterate that I find very interesting from his perspective on mastering. And that the first is very few of his analog mastering that he does comes from an analog source anymore. That it's mostly, not all, but mostly digital mixes that he gets to record into analog. And second, that he said this before, he's like, so few people realize how few real instruments are in any music that's made today anymore. The idea that there's a bunch of guys sitting in a room recording the instruments they play almost doesn't exist for so much of the music that's made.
Yeah.
So things have changed. You're saying, Mark?
First of all, somebody asked me to ask about subwoofers, which I don't want to do because I don't like subwoofers. But stands are something that I am interested in because I actually was able to stack the deck with the MoFi edition by putting them on a pair of $5,000 solid granite stands, and was able to, I was able to make it, get even deeper in the bass and even more impressive. So does Falcon Acoustics want to explore that with the stands and what the stand can do for an LS3 or not?
We actually make our own stand. We've got a second production batch running through now, and it's a fairly simple design, mass filled on columns 60 centimeters high. Yes, it makes a difference. We tuned the fill specifically to the LS3 and it tightens the whole thing right up. It gives better bass and gives us a greater degree of accuracy in the mid-range integration, and it's exactly what it does. What exactly it's supposed to do. So yes, it's important.
About the LS3 that I got in. I was actually somewhat surprised by the size.
That's the one I sent you, right?
It's sitting here in the room with me right now, actually. I was surprised that everything I've heard and read without actually seeing one in person before that thing arrived. Yeah. It's not a big speaker.
No, it's that depth that throws you off. It's only half I was an importer and distributor for many years, and I had a lot of speakers that I represented that claimed to be the LS3 5A of today and this and that. And one of the things they like to do is they like to copy the exact size of the baffle, the front baffle. And they think that's what gets them there. But in reality, they're usually twice as deep as an LS3 5A. LS3 5As look really strange at first because they're so shallow. For instance, that $5,000 pair of stands, the LS3 5A only covered half of the top plate. So it looks strange, but it sounded great. So, but it is. They're tiny, which makes them even more impressive.
Yeah. Well, you've got to remember that originally the idea was that they were going to be carried out by people. My dad was a BBC OB engineer, and he would have had them in a carry case. They were issued them in the day, plus a spare. And I mean, coming back to consistency, the idea was that if you had your spare and one went wrong, you could just plug the spare in and carry on, and you wouldn't notice any difference.
Because of the consistency, right?
Exactly. So that was one of the things about the Kingswood Warren that we tried to emulate, probably with a slightly more upmarket feel to it, with the leather case and everything else. But the idea was that they were carried in a literally in a suitcase-sized box, and I'm taken out of that. So yes, they're small, but they were designed. Remember, they were designed to fit on racks, standard racks, in OB vans and in studios where they could just be popped where they popped down where they needed to be, and they would blend in with all the equipment and everything would fit in seamlessly.
Was there any consideration taken in the design to make them lighter than an average speaker, or are they typically more dense and heavy?
They're quite a heavy little speaker. They come in at, I always think in kilos, I'm afraid, with metric this side of the pond. They're 5.5 kilos at times 6 kilos. So, they are what they are. But the cabinet is quite dense. The plywood is not a lightweight material. And there's a lot of magnets on, the size of the magnets on the woofer, for example. They're not a lightweight piece of equipment at all. No, I don't think anybody worried about the weight. I don't think they worried terribly much about what they looked like either. I think what they worried about was what they sounded like.
Do you think that there's we have an entire podcast about this, but I want to ask this question too. Do you think that there's a magic to the two-way design that is superior over maybe a three-way or other types of design?
No, I think it's. I think they each have their own relevance. What I find about three-way designs is that the number of good mid-range units that are around these days is not very many. It's not. There used to be, certainly when I started out back in the 70s, there used to be a lot of emphasis placed upon mid-range units in the three-ways because that's where the bulk of the information is. Nowadays, we seem to be compromising on the kind of drive units that we put in to drive the mid-range. There's not that many manufacturers that make a dedicated mid-range that you can actually say works well. And that's a sad thing. But a good three-way, a good large speaker will always beat a good small speaker. I don't think there's ever been any argument about that. But in terms of what a small speaker can do, I think the LS3 5A probably comes pretty much up the top end of it.
I felt that you've already answered this, about the LS3 5A specifically. Does Falcon ever look at some of the other designs, like maybe the LS5.9, LS5.8, some of those other designs that are intriguing? Maybe they aren't quite as immortal and legendary as the LS3 5A, but they were excellent speakers of their own time, and I know there's a couple of other people that are still making LS5.9s and 5.8s, and I love the sound of them. So does Falcon ever look at any of that?
Well, we do occasionally look at the LS5.9. I'll be truthful. We were thinking about doing that. I've got being a purist. I went out and I spent the best part of a couple of years sourcing the original polypropylene for the cones. And I've got a roll of the original polypropylene. We could do it. The problem that we have, truthfully, is that we're not a big company, and we're flat out. We're working flat out every day, and the amount of time that I have at the moment for product development is quite limited. I would like to do the LS5.9. We've got some prototype cabinets made. We could probably sit down and do it, but if we were going to do it, we would do it properly. And that means cast chassis, that means using the correct cone material, it means getting everything absolutely right, and that takes time, and that's what, frankly, we haven't got much of at the moment. We're so busy.
Do you think there's a particular amplifier that you really feel that makes the LS3 5A sing?
Depends on your budget range, doesn't it? I'm very careful not to recommend amplifiers because I get into trouble with everybody else when I do. What I will tell you, the best way of answering that question is to say, what do we use when we're at shows? Because that gets me off the hook a bit, if you like, on that one. For larger rooms, because of the MOFI connection, we've been using balanced audio technology recently. Their new valve integrated is an absolute beauty with the LS3 5A. It is so nice. For smaller rooms, we've actually had extremely good results with Primair, the i35. There's a natural synergy between the LS3 5A and the Primair, that you just sort of sit there and you listen, and you think, this is Class D. Well, hang on, it shouldn't do this. And you think, actually, it does. So, those are the two that come to mind immediately. I use quads here at home a lot. I like the old quad sound. My favourite with them is my Radford setup from 1965. And that always does very well. A good tube amp always goes well with them.
I wound up mating the MoFi with the Balanced Audio Technology VK3500, which is a hybrid. Yep. So one of the things that I had on hand were the Jeff Rowland design group, Model 125 power amplifier, which is 125 watts per channel. It's Class D. It's 7.8 pounds, and it was superb. And all I could think about was that you've got little LS3 5As and you've got this little Class D amp. And that's kind of a game changer for a lot of people who live in a small apartment, a small room or whatever. And that the sound between this little Class D amplifier on the LS3 5As was just stunning. It was unbelievably good. So I think it's, just because the system is small doesn't mean that it can't be great. And that was proof of it.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree with that one.
So the LS3 5A, generally speaking, would you say it's an easy, I know this is a very general term, but an easy speaker to drive, an easy speaker? Is it forgiving, or is it more like, it really does need a good synergy with XYZ or something like that?
It's an easy speaker to drive. It was designed by the BBC deliberately to be so. What it does like is an amplifier with a bit of current behind it, so it's got a bit of that, and that way you start to extract the depth of bass that the design is capable of. You don't want to underpower it. It's better slightly overpowered. Bear in mind it's a 15 ohm load, so you're talking sort of 60, 70 watts upwards of conventional Class AB. But what you do need is current. It does like an amplifier with a good solid power supply. If you pick up an amplifier and it weighs half a pound and you can tuck it into your briefcase, it isn't going to be very good with it. So I kind of heft amplifiers now. If people say, "Will this one work?" and if you pick it up and it feels as though it's got some weight to it, the chances are that it's going to be all right. Mind you, I do the same with the cabinets. I have a terrible habit of actually hefting speaker cabinets when they come out of our producers, and I actually pick them up in my hands, and I can usually tell whether they're right or not, which is just based on years and years and years of experience of picking up the cabinets.
Yeah, I did a bookshelf speaker shootout last year, and one of the tests I did was to do like the wrap test on the top of the cabinet, just to kind of hear what it sounds like. Yep. And as you go up, it's actually so interesting, not just how dead the Renaissance is. When you tap on the top, it's like, how much does it vibrate as a whole, but also the pitch. Yep. The more expensive, the more dead the cabinet, the higher the pitch seems to go. It's less of a pop and more of just like a tick, tick, tick. Yep. I always thought that was a very interesting test, just to kind of see how things go, and it has nothing to do with listening, but there it is.
No, it does make a difference. I mean, the cabinet material as well. I mean, you don't use MDF anywhere, for example, in an LS3 5A. It's all done in Baltic ply, and that introduces its own cabinet quality, and it's absolutely crucial and integral to the sonics of the LS3 5A. The cabinet is right. I've seen them done. I've seen clones done in MDF, and they sound inert. They sound dead, muddy. I mean, why bother?
Mark, you got any other questions?
I will ask about the subwoofer. Is that something that you've ever worked on, or have you said no? The LS3 5A is not designed to be used with subwoofers, even though I've seen models in the past from other companies that maybe integrate a subwoofer into the stand. But I personally think that I don't want a subwoofer of any kind messing with that balance of the LS3 But have you guys found anything that you find interesting in terms of subwoofers?
Well, firstly, I share your views on subwoofers and the LS3 so that kind of answers your question. We've been asked several times to look at it. I've kind of shied away from it because it's not something that really engages me, is the honest truth. I sit there and I listen to my speakers. I have various speakers here. I have big ones. I have my LS3 I have all sorts of things here. You can imagine with what we produce that I get I'm able to sort of cherry pick what I'd like to listen to this week a bit. If I want to listen to an LS3 I'd rather listen to an LS3
Mm-hmm. Me too.
And I think, strangely enough, I think also you kind of psychoacoustically adjust to the fact that the bass doesn't go down to 30 hertz. You may not hear that final octave, but your mind kind of compensates for it at the same time, and you just sort of relax into it.
I agree. In fact, I think sometimes I get so used to that when I hear it there, I'm always like, oh, whoa. It startles me a little because I'm not, I don't deal with the full range on a constant basis, but I deal with computer speakers constantly. Mm. So when that is in there, sometimes I'm always like, real life sounds like that, but not, you don't come across it as much unless there's a trash truck going by the house.
Yeah. No, I think, we have an expression in England, it's horses for courses. If you want to buy a smallish speaker, then there are going to be compromises that you're going to have to make, usually on the bottom end, for the very simple reason you can't defy the laws of physics. It is what it is, and you listen to it for what it is. And if without sounding particularly blowing the trumpet, if it's as good as an LS3 when it's singing properly, let it be.
Mm-hmm. What I found was that when I listen near field with the LS3 you no longer have a problem with the bottom octave. No. So that's the trick: is move up, slide up. Even if you don't like near field listening, try it with the LS3 because I listened both ways. But when I moved up, I said, everything I want is there. It just you have to scoot up a little bit.
Yeah, but so that's my views on that on subs anyway. Well, I'm always available if people want to send emails and things like that. So, there we go. But I hope this has been some help to you this evening anyway. It's giving you probably a little bit of historic flavour that you may not have got otherwise.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and Audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.